For once, I can't guarantee I won't interrupt you, but that's just my nature. Jenny, your go first of all. You do get your 1 minute with the talking stick. What's firing up this week?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Well, from the 1st of July, childcare will be cheaper for many families across the country. So the average family on $120,000 a year will have childcare costs cut by around $1,700 a year. This is a really important change coming at a time when we know many households are looking at their budgets and looking at how they can really find space for the things that they want to do for their families. But it matters for the economy too. Investment in early childhood sets our kids up for the best possible start in life. Creating the space for women, and let's face it, it's usually women, to return to work when they choose to, helps with our labour force. But of course, for women who want to earn and who want career continuity, these investments are incredibly important for their economic participation. This is all part of our government's determination to return the economic interests of women to the centre of our policy making, because it's good for women, it's good for families, and it's also good for the economy.
All right, Jenny, thank you. I can tell you, becoming a parent, the late nights were a shock, but the childcare bills trumped all of that. Jane, you've been in estimates this week, so you must be thrilled to be out and on the other side. What have you been focusing on?
Tom, you're right. 2 weeks of Senate estimates have confirmed really what we already knew, that Labor has no plan to tackle inflation, no plan to balance the books and no plan to bring down debt. And some of the accounting that we saw in the budget was as rubbery as the chicken course at a wedding. Let me start with the NDIS. The biggest save banked in this budget was a reduction in the spending growth of NDIS from 14% down to 8%. But when we scratched the surface and asked which policies were supporting that considerable reduction in spending growth, the answer was, we're working on it. We're working on it. That's not good enough. And the second one that I want to talk about is the National Reconstruction Fund, which was a signature election commitment of the Labor government. But when we asked about the National Reconstruction Fund, we found that they are in fact borrowing $5 billion of taxpayers' money, borrowing on their behalf at considerable cost to the debt and into interest repayments. But in fact, they're only forecasting to earn a rate of return that you or I could get, less than you or I could get on a term deposit from a bank. Now, that's simply not good enough. But the most frustrating thing for me was the active removal of the objective of reducing inflation from the budget. And that means that Australians will pay a price.
Well, we've had a lot of economic data out this week. Of course, minimum wage decision today. Inflation data on Wednesday. Treasurer is defending the figures. Economists do predict a surge in inflation, though, could mean another interest rate rise. This is how the week unfolded.
We need to be careful about the monthly figure, which bounces around from month to month and can be volatile.
I don't think that the budget is adding to inflation. It's actually reducing inflation.
If we just had the inflation numbers on their own, I don't think that'd be enough to trigger the RBA. But when you put that together with the wages situation, that could trigger the Reserve Bank to raise rates.
Higher interest rates that are going up and up and up to try and manage inflation are simply making it worse.
If it's all left up to the Reserve Bank, they've only got one tool, and we're worried that they're going to not only cause more pain for people, but push the country towards recession if rates keep going up.
The other way that you could reduce aggregate demand at the moment is to increase taxes or reduce government spending. It's easier for us to increase interest rates.
There you go. Jane, you made an appearance there, glasses in hand. It's sure that you pose at estimates in case people don't watch it. We've got the Fair Work decision as well today, an interesting one, 5.75% the increase. It will actually be higher effectively, a bit of a jump up for the $180,000 on the national minimum wage. What's your reaction to this decision today, Jane?
Well, I think that, the Fair Work decision makes its decisions based on an awful lot of data, and, I think everybody's come out and said we're a little bit disappointing. It doesn't matter whether it's industry groups or whether it's union groups. It tends to be that you're somewhere in the right vicinity if everybody's disappointed. The big concern, of course, though, and Philip Lowe made the comments this week at Estimates, is the risk of a wage price spiral. Now, he said we're not there yet, but he wanted to make sure that those pressures on the economy were minimised in order for that not to happen. Where that is, we'll find out next week, I suppose, when the RBA makes its decision.
So, Jenny, I guess by definition, Labor's disappointed, 5.75% below inflation. Did you want to see this high, this decision today?
Look, this is actually an incredibly important decision for low-wage Australian workers, and it is actually an enormously significant change to their wage. Some of the technical changes introduced by the Commission in making this decision mean that the increase, in fact, will be practically significantly higher than 5%. I know my colleague, Mr Burke, is up shortly to talk about the implications of that decision. It has real-world effects, of course. These are some of our lowest paid workers. They are, majority of them are women, or very high concentrations of women in these sectors, a lot of young people, a lot of casual workers. These are people for whom inflation really hurts. And this will be a very, very important and significant increase for those workers.
We keep
Well,
hearing
it's a big reminder, isn't it? I mean, you know, real wages are going backwards. I mean, and that was a big promise prior to the election, Jenny, that your party made, that real wages were going to get moving again. Well, they are moving, they're just moving in the wrong direction. So I can imagine that there'll be a lot of people that are pretty disappointed that you guys haven't been able to live up to your promise of keeping real wages moving.
Was it the promise itself that was the problem? Just on that, Jane, was it the promise that was the problem, though? I mean, inflation was clearly coming down the line when Labor got into power. You wouldn't really be blaming them, would you, for the inflation that was about to kick off when they came in? That was already
absolutely. This is why we've kept talking about this. That's why we keep talking about this, Tom. The government needs to be doing all it can do to lower inflation, because that's really the only way you're going to be able to get real wages moving again without, you know, having artificial means that can potentially make the situation worse. So that's why the government needs to do everything in its toolkit to get inflation down, and it's failed to do so, which is why the RBA keeps having to push up rates.
Couple of things here, Tom. I mean, firstly, we're not going to take lectures from people who were clear that in their time of government, low wages were a deliberate design feature of their economic policy. Secondly,
but real wages never went backwards.
In relation to inflation, there have been very significant global pressures that have washed right across the global economy, arising from the war in Ukraine and constraints in supply chains following the COVID pandemic. Everyone understands those, and those pressures have manifested themselves internationally and also here in Australia. The budget that we delivered is deliberately constructed to provide targeted relief where we can, to take the sting out of a year that we accept will be really difficult for Australians. And those Australians are at the front of our mind when we're putting together our economic policy. But the budget is deliberately also very, very measured in this regard. The measures we took to take the sting out of cost of living, targeted and spread over time, significant upgrades to revenue returned to the budget, in stark contrast to the approach taken by our predecessors. You can keep saying these lines, Jane, but I'm just not actually sure what it is that you propose ought to be done differently.
Jane, just quickly on that, you had this committee looking into cost of living. Was there a magic silver bullet solution that the budget could have had that didn't?
Well, the biggest thing the budget could have done is reduce spending, and it failed to do so. It failed to reduce spending. In fact, its spending trajectory keeps continuing to rise over and over again, not once. In fact, the spending compared to the revenue in this budget is 2 to 1. 2 to 1. And we proved that this week, and there was no way that the Treasury could deny it. Right. So they're not doing what they can do to reduce inflation. Yes, the Cost of Living Committee is still going on. It's been travelling right around the country. It's returned an interim report, which is not one with recommendations. They will come later in the year. But there's been some pretty good evidence that by reducing red tape, increasing competition, yes, you can put downward pressure on inflation, and the government is failing to do so.